This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, business, events and incidents are the products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously, and any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental.
Elias Moreno had never considered himself the kind of person who believed in ghosts, curses, or stories about houses where something terrible had happened decades ago and refused to leave. At 34, he had already worked enough difficult jobs to know that most frightening situations had ordinary explanations. And he generally preferred those explanations because ordinary problems could usually be repaired, replaced, or avoided. He had spent several years working in a furniture warehouse before the company downsized, leaving him unemployed with rent due, several unpaid bills, and very little savings. That was why he accepted the caretaker position at the Old Vale estate without asking too many questions when the property manager told him that the job came with unusually high pay. A private room, food expenses, and almost no supervision. The work sounded simple enough. Elias would live on the property, maintain the gardens, clean the house, inspect the plumbing and electrical systems, and make sure nobody entered the premises without permission. The owner, an elderly man named Adrian Vale, rarely stayed there anymore, so Elias would have the enormous house almost entirely to himself. The only condition that seemed strange was that one bedroom on the second floor was permanently locked, and Elias was specifically instructed never to enter it. The estate stood several kilometers outside the nearest town, beyond a narrow road surrounded by thick trees and abandoned farmland. The house had been built more than a century earlier and had the imposing appearance of a place that had once belonged to an important family, but had been slowly forgotten by everyone who had inherited it. Its stone walls were darkened by age and moisture. The windows were tall and narrow, and the roof was covered with patches of moss that made the entire structure appear older than it actually was. A neglected garden surrounded the property, containing dead rose bushes, overgrown hedges, and a dry stone fountain covered with cracks. When Elias arrived with his belongings, the owner was waiting beside the front entrance with an elderly man named Samuel Ortega, who had apparently served as the caretaker for the previous 17 years. Samuel was thin, gray-haired, and noticeably nervous, and although he was polite throughout the tour, Elias noticed that his expression changed whenever they approached the staircase leading to the second floor. Samuel showed Elias the kitchen, storage rooms, electrical panel, generator, water pump, basement, garden shed, and caretaker's quarters before taking him upstairs. The second floor contained several bedrooms, a study, an old sitting room, and a long hallway ending at a dark wooden door. Samuel stopped before that door and explained that it was the only room Elias was forbidden to enter. The door was secured with an old brass lock, and there was no key among the collection Samuel handed over. When Elias asked what was inside, Samuel said that the room had belonged to Adrian Vale's daughter and had remained closed since her death. Elias asked whether there were valuable possessions inside that required protection, but Samuel shook his head and explained that the owner simply did not want anyone disturbing the room. He then became unusually serious and told Elias that if he heard noises coming from behind the door, he should ignore them and continue with whatever he was doing. Elias laughed at the strange instruction because he assumed Samuel was exaggerating the eccentricity of the owner, but Samuel did not laugh with him. Before leaving the following morning, Samuel repeated the warning and added that the previous caretakers had all been given the same instruction, although he was the only one who had stayed for more than a few years. For the first week, Elias found the job almost embarrassingly easy. He spent his mornings repairing the garden fence, removing weeds, cleaning rooms that had accumulated years of dust, and checking the plumbing. In the evenings, he cooked dinner and watched television in the caretaker's quarters before going to bed. The house was old and made plenty of ordinary noises, particularly during the colder hours of the night, and Elias quickly became accustomed to floorboards creaking beneath his feet and pipes knocking inside the walls. He also became accustomed to the occasional sound of branches scraping against the windows because of the large trees surrounding the estate. Nothing about the first few nights gave him any reason to believe that the locked bedroom was anything more than an old room that the owner did not want disturbed. The first unusual sound occurred shortly after midnight on his 6th night. Elias had just turned off the television when he heard what sounded like a heavy wooden object being dragged across the floor above his bedroom. The sound lasted several seconds before stopping, and because his room was directly beneath the second-floor hallway, he initially assumed that something had fallen over upstairs. He waited for another sound, and a few moments later, he heard the scraping again, this time followed by what sounded like a dull impact against a wall. Elias eventually got out of bed and climbed the staircase, intending to inspect the upper floor. But the moment he reached the hallway, the noise stopped. The bedroom remained locked, and nothing else appeared disturbed. He checked the other rooms and found no explanation, so he returned downstairs and convinced himself that an old piece of furniture had shifted because of the temperature. The explanation became difficult to maintain when the same thing happened the following night. The scraping began at almost exactly the same time and continued for several minutes, and Elias could hear the sound of something heavy being pushed across the wooden floor repeatedly. He climbed the stairs again, but this time he stopped several meters from the bedroom and listened without approaching the door. The sound was unmistakably coming from inside the locked room. He could hear furniture being dragged, followed by several dull thumps that seemed to come from different parts of the room. When he finally reached the door, everything became completely quiet. Elias placed his hand against the wood and immediately noticed that it was unnaturally cold compared with the surrounding hallway. He removed his hand and stood there for a moment before returning to his room, deciding that whatever explanation existed for the noises, he did not want to discover it in the middle of the night. The following morning, Elias noticed several fresh scratches in the floorboards outside the bedroom. They were long, narrow marks extending from beneath the door toward the center of the hallway, as though the legs of a heavy piece of furniture had been dragged from inside the room. He crouched down and examined them carefully, then looked at the door and realized that the marks could not have been made from the hallway because they disappeared underneath it. There was no obvious way for anyone to move furniture through the locked door without opening it, and Elias knew that he had been the only person inside the house that night. He contacted Adrian and described what had happened, expecting the owner to be concerned. But Adrian merely told him that old houses sometimes produce strange noises and reminded him not to enter the bedroom. What bothered Elias was not the explanation itself, but the owner's reaction, because Adrian had sounded less surprised than a man who had already heard the exact same complaint many times. The noises gradually became more frequent, and Elias began hearing footsteps inside the room as well. They were slow footsteps that moved from one side of the bedroom to the other, sometimes stopping directly behind the locked door before continuing toward the window. On several nights, Elias could hear what sounded like someone walking around the bed, followed by the scraping of furniture. One night, while he was preparing coffee in the kitchen, he heard the unmistakable sound of a chair being dragged across the upstairs floor. He stopped what he was doing and listened as the chair seemed to move several times, followed by a series of quiet footsteps. The footsteps eventually reached the bedroom door, and although Elias could not see anyone from the kitchen, he heard the floorboards outside the room creak as though someone had stepped into the hallway. He remained downstairs until the sound stopped, and when he finally went upstairs, there was nothing there except the locked door and the same fresh scratches across the floor. A few days later, Adrian came to the estate unexpectedly, and Elias decided to ask him directly about Clara. Adrian was visibly uncomfortable when Elias mentioned his daughter's name, but after several moments, he explained that Clara had died 26 years earlier when she was only 22. She had grown up in the house and had occupied the upstairs bedroom throughout most of her childhood and adolescence. According to Adrian, Clara had been a quiet young woman who enjoyed reading, painting, and spending time alone. But during the final year of her life, she began complaining about strange noises in her bedroom. At first, she told her parents that someone was walking around while she slept, but eventually, she claimed that furniture was moving on its own. Adrian had assumed that she was experiencing severe anxiety or nightmares, particularly because there was never any evidence that an intruder had entered the property. Clara eventually began moving furniture against her bedroom door every night before going to sleep. She would drag her wardrobe toward the entrance, move her desk across the room, and place a chair beside the bed. Adrian became frustrated because he believed she was damaging valuable furniture, and whenever he confronted her, Clara insisted that the furniture was not being moved to protect her from an intruder, but to prevent something already inside the room from reaching her. According to Adrian, she once told him that the thing had begun moving the furniture while she was awake, and that she had watched the wardrobe slowly slide across the floor without anyone touching it. Adrian admitted that he did not believe her, and eventually became angry with her for frightening herself with what he considered an imaginary presence. 3 nights before Clara died, she had a final argument with her father about the bedroom. She told him that whatever was inside had stopped trying to frighten her and had begun preparing the room for something. Adrian did not understand what she meant and refused to discuss it further. The next morning, he found Clara unconscious beside the bed. She died before reaching the hospital, and the doctors determined that she had suffered a sudden cardiac event. There were no signs of physical violence, no evidence that anyone had entered the house, and no explanation for why the furniture in the bedroom had been rearranged during the night. Adrian said that he had never entered the room again after Clara's funeral, and that was why he had kept it locked ever since. Elias asked Adrian whether Clara had ever explained what she believed was happening, and the elderly man remained silent for so long that Elias assumed he would refuse to answer. Eventually, Adrian admitted that Clara had become convinced the bedroom was connected to an older death that had occurred there decades before she was born. She had discovered old records describing a 17-year-old girl named Margaret Harrow who had died inside the same room during the late 19th century. Margaret had been the daughter of the man who originally owned the property, and according to the records, she had become pregnant before marriage. Her father had been terrified that the pregnancy would damage the family's reputation, so he locked her inside the unfinished upstairs room and prevented her from leaving the house. Margaret eventually went into labor while still confined inside the bedroom, and both she and the infant died there. The official records were vague about what happened afterward, but local accounts described hearing Margaret crying and pleading for someone to open the door during the final days of her life. Neighbors reported hearing furniture being dragged across the floor during the nights before her death, and one account claimed that Margaret repeatedly complained that someone was standing beside her bed. Her father denied that she had been mistreated and insisted that her death was caused by complications during childbirth. The bedroom was sealed after her death, and the family eventually sold the property. Over the following decades, the room changed owners several times, and each time it was eventually occupied by another young woman who began reporting strange disturbances before dying under circumstances that were never fully explained. Elias initially thought Adrian was telling him an exaggerated family legend, but the documents he discovered later convinced him otherwise. Hidden inside an old cabinet downstairs were newspaper clippings and handwritten notes concerning previous occupants of the house. The earliest reports described Margaret's death, while later documents described young women who had occupied the same bedroom and experienced almost identical phenomena. One woman complained that she heard footsteps circling her bed. Every night, another became convinced that someone was entering her room while she slept and began pushing furniture against the door. A third reportedly died after claiming for several weeks that the bedroom was being rearranged while she was awake, The details changed from one generation to another, but the pattern remained remarkably consistent, and every account mentioned furniture moving without explanation. Elias eventually found Clara's own notes hidden inside a drawer beneath a stack of old photographs. Clara had spent months researching the house and had reached a conclusion that explained why the bedroom continued to produce the same phenomena. She believed that Margaret's spirit had never left because Margaret had died in the room while believing that someone would eventually open the door and rescue her. Clara did not believe the entity was simply a ghost wandering through the house. She believed that the bedroom had become a kind of prison built around the final memory of Margaret's death, and that every person who entered the room became trapped within that memory. The moving furniture was not random activity, but part of the room's attempt to recreate the exact conditions surrounding Margaret's final moments, which explained why the same pieces of furniture always seemed to move into the same positions. Clara's notes became increasingly desperate toward the end. She wrote that the entity did not appear immediately when someone entered the room because it needed the person to believe that nothing was wrong. The room would remain ordinary until the person became comfortable, after which the furniture would begin moving and the footsteps would become more frequent. Eventually, the person would hear a woman calling from somewhere inside the room and would begin believing that the voice belonged to someone who needed help. Clara had discovered that the voice sometimes sounded like Margaret and sometimes like previous victims, but she suspected that it could imitate anyone whose voice the person would trust. Her final pages contained a warning that frightened Elias more than anything else because Clara had written that the room did not simply want to frighten people, it wanted them to stay. That night, Elias heard a woman's voice calling his name from upstairs. He was sitting in the kitchen when he first heard it, and for several seconds, he assumed the sound had come from outside. The voice was soft and frightened, and although it was impossible to understand the words at first, Elias eventually realized that someone was asking him to open the bedroom door. He recognized the voice as Clara's because he had heard recordings of her from an old family video he had discovered downstairs. The voice continued calling him, becoming increasingly desperate as Elias remained in the kitchen. He eventually climbed halfway up the staircase, but stopped when he heard footsteps moving inside the locked bedroom. The voice then told him that she was trapped and that the thing inside was moving the bed again. Elias remained where he was until the voice gradually faded, refusing to approach the door. The following morning, Elias decided that he would leave the job. The salary no longer mattered because he had become convinced that remaining inside the house was dangerous, and he spent several hours packing his belongings into his car. Before he could leave, however, he heard the sound of furniture moving upstairs again, except this time it was accompanied by a deep scraping noise that continued for several minutes. Elias looked toward the staircase and saw that the bedroom door was open. He knew he had locked it himself after discovering Clara's notes, and he also knew that he had not been given the key. Nevertheless, the door stood open several inches, revealing only a narrow section of the dark room beyond it. Elias should have walked out of the house, but the discovery that the room was open created a feeling of curiosity that he could not suppress. He climbed the stairs slowly and pushed the door farther inward. The bedroom looked completely ordinary, with an old wooden bed near the center, a wardrobe against one wall, and a desk beneath the window. Dust covered nearly every surface, and there were no signs that anyone had entered the room recently. Elias searched the corners, examined the windows, and checked the wardrobe, but found nothing that could explain the sounds. The only unusual thing was the bed, which stood several feet away from the position shown in the photographs Clara had collected. Elias approached it and noticed deep scratches beneath the wooden legs. The marks indicated that the bed had been dragged across the floor many times, and when he looked closely, he realized that some of the scratches were much older than others. He followed them across the room and saw that they formed several overlapping patterns, suggesting that the bed had repeatedly been moved between the same positions. Beneath the mattress, he discovered a small wooden box containing more of Clara's papers, including a final page that explained what she believed the entity was trying to accomplish. According to Clara, the furniture always moved until the room resembled the arrangement recorded in the earliest descriptions of Margaret's death. The bed would eventually face the door. The wardrobe would move toward the wall, and the desk would shift beneath the window. Clara believed that the room was attempting to recreate the moment when Margaret died, so precisely that the next person inside would become part of it. While Elias was reading, the room became noticeably colder, and he began to hear a faint sound that resembled someone breathing near the window. He looked toward the glass and saw his reflection staring back at him, but another figure appeared behind his shoulder. It was a young woman wearing a faded nightdress with long dark hair hanging around a pale face. Elias turned around, expecting to find someone standing behind him, but the room was empty. When he looked back toward the window, the figure remained visible in the reflection. She was standing beside the bed, and although her face was unfamiliar, Elias understood that he was looking at Margaret Harrow. The figure slowly raised one hand and pointed toward the bed, and Elias noticed that the mattress had developed a deep indentation, as though someone had just sat down. Another indentation appeared beside it while he watched, and the room began filling with the faint sound of a baby crying. Elias backed toward the door, but the door closed before he could reach it. The furniture then began moving around him, and every object shifted with the same slow, deliberate scraping that he had heard on previous nights. The wardrobe moved toward the wall, the desk slid beneath the window, and the bed crossed the floor until it occupied the exact position described in Clara's notes. Elias understood that the room was reconstructing Margaret's final moments, and when the bed stopped moving, the crying became louder while the woman's reflection in the mirror changed from Margaret's face to Clara's. Elias tried the door repeatedly, but it would not open. The voice he had heard downstairs now came from directly behind him, and Clara was pleading with him not to lie down on the bed because that was what the room wanted. He turned toward the mirror again and saw several figures standing behind the bed, each one belonging to a different woman who had died in the bedroom over the previous century. They did not appear as solid bodies, but as pale reflections layered over one another, and every face was turned toward the bed. Elias realized that Clara had been right about the room preserving the memories of its victims. They were not wandering through the house because they had nowhere else to go. They were trapped inside the same moment, forced to watch the bedroom recreate Margaret's death whenever another person entered. The bedroom door suddenly opened, and Elias ran without looking back. He reached the staircase, nearly fell while descending, and escaped through the front entrance with nothing except the clothes he was wearing. He spent the night in a motel several kilometers away and returned the following morning with Adrian. The owner listened silently while Elias described what had happened, and when they reached the upstairs hallway, Adrian stopped before the bedroom and asked him whether he had touched the bed. Elias insisted that he had not. Adrian entered the room alone and remained there for several minutes before returning with a look of genuine fear. He told Elias that the bed had been moved into the center of the room, exactly where Margaret had supposedly died more than a century earlier. Adrian finally confessed that he had known more about the bedroom than he had ever told Elias. He admitted that Clara had discovered the history shortly before her death and had become convinced that the room was selecting people to continue the cycle. Adrian had kept the bedroom locked because he believed that preventing anyone from entering was the only way to stop the disturbances. The unusually high salary offered to Elias had been deliberate because previous caretakers had eventually quit after hearing the noises, and Adrian had needed someone willing to remain on the property. Samuel had lasted 17 years because he understood the danger and refused to approach the bedroom, but even he had eventually begged Adrian to to find someone else to take over the job. Elias left the property permanently that day, and although Adrian offered him additional money to remain silent about what he had experienced, Elias refused. The old house was eventually inherited by distant relatives after Adrian's death, and they attempted to sell it without telling potential buyers about its history. The property changed hands twice over the following years, but neither owner remained for long. The first claimed that the upstairs bedroom was infested with animals despite finding no evidence of them, while the second abandoned the house after repeatedly hearing furniture moving during the night. Eventually, the estate was left empty, and the road leading to it became overgrown enough that people from the nearby town stopped visiting. Elias tried to forget the house, but several years later, he received an envelope containing a photograph of the upstairs bedroom. There was no return address, and the photograph showed the old bed positioned against the wall beneath the window. Elias immediately recognized the room, but something about the image disturbed him because he knew that the bed had never stood there when he lived at the estate. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten date from several months earlier, and a sentence stating that the bedroom had been opened again. Elias threw the photograph away, but several weeks later, another photograph arrived, showing the same room from a different angle. This time, the bed was positioned in the center of the floor, and there was a visible depression in the mattress, as though someone had been sitting on it. Elias never learned who had taken the photographs or why they had been sent to him, but the final photograph arrived almost a year later and contained something that made him understand that the haunting had not ended when he left. The photograph showed the upstairs bedroom exactly as he remembered it on the night he entered, with the wardrobe against the wall, the desk beneath the window, and the old bed in the center of the room. A figure was standing beside the bed, partially reflected in the dark glass of the window. The face was not Margaret's, and it was not Clara's. It was Elias's own face, except that the figure looked much older and was wearing the same clothes Elias had been wearing on the night he escaped. He kept the photograph despite every instinct telling him to destroy it, because he could not stop wondering how someone could have taken a picture of something that had never happened. He eventually realized that the answer was contained in the position of the bed. Clara had written that the bedroom did not recreate a person's death until the person entered the room, and the bed always moved first because it was preparing the final scene. Elias had escaped before the room could finish what it had started, but whatever remained inside the house had apparently preserved his image anyway, perhaps because the bedroom considered his escape temporary. Elias has never returned to the estate, and he refuses to discuss the house with anyone who asks about the caretaker position. The property still stands beyond the abandoned road, and according to people who live nearby, the upstairs windows sometimes show movement, even though the electricity was disconnected years ago. Those who pass the property at night occasionally hear the sound of furniture being dragged across the second floor, and some claim that the noises stop whenever someone approaches the front gate. The house has remained empty for years, yet the bedroom continues to be found in different arrangements whenever someone manages to enter it. The bed is never in the same place for long, and beneath its legs are layers of scratches created by more than a century of movement. The reason Elias remembers the bedroom so vividly is not because of the woman he saw in the mirror or the voice of the dead child he heard beneath the bed. What stays with him is the realization that the room never needed to attack anyone physically in order to claim them. It only needed to convince them that there was nothing dangerous inside, allow their curiosity to overcome the warning, and then begin rebuilding the same scene that had been repeated since Margaret Harrow died behind a locked door. Every person who entered believed they were investigating the haunting, but the room was never waiting to be investigated. It was waiting for someone to enter, because once the door opened, the bedroom could begin preparing the bed for another death.